Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're talking about one of the most ridiculous American legends ever invented. A story so big, it basically laughs at physics. I'm talking about Paul Bunyan and his blue ox, Babe. You've probably heard the greatest hits. Paul is a giant. Babe is the size of a hill. And together they clear forests like it's a casual weekend hobby. He drags his axe so hard, it cuts valleys. He stomps so deep, it makes lakes. He sneezes, and the weather changes. And that leads to the real question that actually matters. Why did people need a giant lumberjack in the first place? Because Paul Bunyan is not a history story. He's a work story. A survival story. A stress relief story. A joke told by people doing brutal labor in brutal places. Now, the myth version is simple. Paul Bunyan is basically a walking natural disaster. He and Babe create parts of the landscape by accident. The world becomes a map made out of their mistakes. It's funny, it's epic, and it makes the frontier feel like a playground for superhuman strength. But the real version is more interesting. Paul Bunyan is what happens when a hard job becomes so exhausting and repetitive that the only way to make it feel human is to exaggerate it into comedy. Because logging in the 1800s and early 1900s wasn't the clean, romantic image people get from postcards. It was cold, wet, dangerous, loud, and nonstop. Men lived in camps far from town. Food was heavy and basic. Workdays were long. Injuries were common. The weather did not negotiate. And if you didn't laugh, you'd go a little bit nuts. So lumber camps had a culture. Songs, nicknames, pranks, superstitions, and stories. Tall tales weren't just entertainment. They were a tool. A way to turn misery into something you could brag about. A way to take a job that could grind you down and flip it into something you could own. Because if the forest is bigger than you, the cold is bigger than you, and the job never ends, you have two options. Option 1, feel small. Option 2, invent a guy so large the forest feels like a toothpick. That's Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan's stories work like a pressure valve. They take a world that is harsh and unfair, and they turn it into a world that is absurd and funny. They don't deny the difficulty. They mock it. A normal person says, "We worked all day and barely made progress." A tall tale says, "Paul cut so many trees before lunch that the sun filed a complaint." It's the same emotional truth, just told with steroids. Now let's talk about Babe, because Babe is not just an animal sidekick. Babe is the second half of the fantasy. In real logging, animals were power. Oxen and horses mattered. They dragged logs, pulled sleds, and moved supplies. If you had a strong team, you could do more work, move faster, survive longer, and maybe even keep your job. So in the tall tale universe, of course, Paul doesn't have a normal ox. He has the best ox imaginable. And Babe being blue is the kind of detail that tells you exactly what these stories are made of. It's not realistic. It's campfire realistic. It feels like something a tired person would say at night after being frozen all day. It was so cold, everything turned blue. Even the ox, that's not a fact. That's a vibe. And these stories were built for vibes. They were told out loud, usually at night, usually with people who knew the work, the danger, and the boredom. They were designed to get laughs. They were designed to get reactions. They were designed to one-up the last storyteller. Because a tall tale isn't a book at first. It's a performance. Someone starts with a claim. Someone else makes it bigger. And by the end, Paul Bunyan is basically rearranging geography. That's why the Paul made lakes myth exists. It's the natural endpoint of a game where the only rule is bigger. But here's what happened next, and this part is important. Once Paul Bunyan became popular, companies noticed. This is where the story shifts from camp humor into American marketing. Businesses in the lumber world started using Paul Bunyan as a symbol, not because they believed he was real, obviously, but because he represented what they wanted to sell: strength, productivity, control over nature, and the idea that logging was heroic instead of exhausting. The legend got cleaned up, polished, and packaged. The rough edges of real camp life don't fit nicely on a brochure. So the legend became friendlier, more family-friendly, more like a mascot. And that's how a work joke becomes folklore that gets printed, illustrated, and taught like it's always existed in the same form. So when people ask, was Paul Bunyan real? They're asking the wrong question. The better question is, what was Paul Bunyan for? He was for morale. He was for identity. He was for laughing at work that could chew you up. Think about what a lumberjack camp needed. It needed a way to make tough people feel proud without sounding sentimental. It needed a way to pass time. It needed a way to turn danger into something you could stare at and not blink. So you invent a giant who never gets tired, never gets scared, and never loses. Because real people get tired. Real people get scared. Real people lose. Tall tales don't fix reality. They make reality bearable. And there's another layer that people miss. These stories also build community. If you've never lived in a camp environment, it's hard to understand how important shared jokes are. When you're far from home, everyone smells like smoke and sweat, and tomorrow is going to be the same grind again. Shared stories become a kind of glue. You laugh at the same punchlines. You know the same characters. You recognize the same exaggerations. Paul Bunyan becomes an inside joke, so big it becomes a culture. Now let's bring it back to the myth we started with. Did Paul Bunyan create lakes and carve valleys and reshape the map? No. That's the point. He's a giant made of exaggeration. But did the Paul Bunyan stories create something real? Yes. They created a way for working people to tell the story of their lives without turning it into a complaint. And honestly, that's one of the most American things imaginable. Because America has always had a complicated relationship with work. On one hand, work is sold as pride and virtue. On the other hand, work can be brutal and unfair. Tall tales split the difference. They say, this is hard, without sounding weak. They say, this is ridiculous, without sounding hopeless. They say, we survived it, while laughing. And Babe matters here too, because Babe is the fantasy of partnership. Work animals were real companions. They were tools, yes, but they were also living creatures you depended on. If your team failed, you were stuck. If your team held, you kept moving. So the legend makes that relationship gigantic too. Babe isn't just strong. Babe is unstoppable. It's a wish. Now, there's also a reason Paul Bunyan stuck around when other camp stories didn't. Paul Bunyan is easy to remix. You can drop him into any region. You can attach him to any landmark. You can change the details and still keep the core. Big man, big ox. Big work. Big jokes. That flexibility lets the story travel. And when it travels, it becomes less about the original lumber camps and more about a national idea. The frontier as a place where humans are so powerful they can reshape the world. That's the romantic version. The reality is, the frontier reshaped humans too. It exhausted them, injured them, and demanded teamwork and luck. Most workers weren't giant heroes. They were regular people trying to get paid and get through winter. So if you want to understand Paul Bunyan correctly, don't picture a superhero. Picture a group of workers at the end of a long day, eating heavy food, listening to the wind outside, and trying to make each other laugh. That's where Paul lives. Not in a history textbook, not in a museum display, in the space where people turn hardship into story. So, what's the real takeaway from Paul Bunyan and Babe? And that answers the question we started with. Why did people meet giant lumberjacks?